Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Richard, today's host. For this episode, we're talking with Nicholas Buccola. He's a professor in political science at Linfield College in Oregon and is the author of The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass, the editor of The Essential Douglass, and of Abraham Lincoln and Liberal Democracy, among other works. And in his new book called The Fire is Upon Us, we will talk about it today. And this book by Nick then is on the important 1965 debate between James Baldwin and William Buckley Jr. It's an intellectual biography of Baldwin, a major writer and intellectual of the civil rights movement, and Buckley, a big influence on the American conservative movement. And both men's ideas are still highly relevant today. So, hi, Nick, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Richard. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Right, so I think before we really dive into these topics, could you say a bit more about what first got you interested in this general topic of the book?
Yeah, so the book started with Baldwin. I was invited to write an essay about Baldwin several years ago for a really wonderful collection. Ended up being called The Political Companion to James Baldwin. And when I started working on that project, I had not done a whole lot of work with Baldwin, and I just dug into Baldwin. I had about 2 years to work on the essay, so I spent several months reading all the Baldwin I could get my hands on, and was immediately just kind of obsessed with his thought, and thought there was a lot there that I could that I was learning a lot, and I thought there was a lot there that was still relevant to so many issues that we're talking about today. And so early in that process of getting to know Baldwin, I came across the debate with Buckley, and there's the BBC recording of the debate, is available on YouTube. So I watched that, and I just was sort of transfixed by that encounter. Buckley is somebody who was on my radar as somebody that was. I wasn't sure exactly how I would write about him, but I thought that he was, I've been interested in the American conservative movement, and trying to figure out various ways to write about it. And so this idea that putting Buckley and Baldwin together on this stage, was just completely fascinating to me. Such dramatically different life experiences, such dramatically different worldviews. And so I framed my essay that I wrote about Baldwin using the Buckley Baldwin debate. And as I worked on the essay, I kept thinking to myself, there's a book in here. There's so much, that to think about in terms of this moment in history and its significance, but also the broader history of which it's a part. And so as I worked on the essay, I kind of had a book in the back of my mind, and began working on the book in earnest in 2015, and then actually writing in 2016. And so so that's the kind of story of how it all started. And as I worked through the process in those early days, the kind of shape of the book changed. I initially had an idea of writing a shorter book about the Cambridge debate, and really there had been a couple books about Malcolm X visiting Oxford in '64, and so I thought maybe I could do something like Baldwin at Cambridge in '65. But as I dug into the research, I sort of recognized there was a broader story to tell. Baldwin and Buckley born about a year apart from each other. So as you mentioned in the introduction, the basic idea I had was to sort of weave their intellectual biographies against the backdrop of the rise of the civil rights and conservative movement. So that's why it ends up being a much larger book than it would have been otherwise.
Right, yeah. So I think before we come really to this big debate, I think it would also be nice to talk a bit more about the two protagonists here. So maybe also for some listeners who may not really be familiar with them. So I think we'll just start out with James Baldwin. If you could talk a bit about him first. He you mentioned before, with the time of the debate, also he's a really well-known, famous writer already. But I think his youth was also really important. Marked him a lot in Harlem and his
Mhm.
time overseas in France, for example. So maybe if you could just talk us a bit about his time, his earlier time before the
Yeah,
debate. Mm.
absolutely. Yeah, so Baldwin, I was born in Harlem in 1924, and he was the oldest of 9 children. And he describes in a lot of his autobiographical writings and describes indirectly in his autobiographical fiction what life was like for him growing up in Harlem in the 20s and 30s. And he talks about, the defining fact of his parents' lives was that they often had a hard time feeding their children. And so he really describes life in Harlem in those days as, he was at the margins of the margins, and he described watching his parents struggle to feed their children and struggle to try to find some, way to survive and in this very very hostile world. And so Baldwin's upbringing, I think, is really really important in terms of shaping the sort of thinker he became. He was very interested in trying to see the world, through the eyes of others. And one of the things that he discovered very early on in his life was the power of language, the power of words. I mean, he was somebody who became, a voracious reader at a very young age, and was really fascinated by the possibility of connecting people through time and space through words. And so he began reading a lot, began writing a lot, and really he found through language a kind of way, a sort of means of survival in those circumstances. And so um, Baldwin ends up, he describes in for The Fire Next Time, the major essay in The Fire Next Time, which he called Down at the Cross. He describes, what it was like to be a teenager in Harlem in those days, and all the threats to his physical safety, all the threats to his psychological well-being. Baldwin was also somebody who was grappling with a lot of questions of sexual identity in those days. And so Baldwin basically ends up, finding a kind of temporary refuge, also through language, by becoming a young minister in the Harlem storefront churches. And so that's something. His father was a lay Pentecostal minister as well. And Baldwin, he describes in Down at the Cross the experience of kind of having this dramatic conversion experience into the church, and then, within 3 years, a dramatic, conversion experience out of the church. But there's really something about Baldwin as preacher that sort of stays with him throughout his life. And I argue in the book that he's a preacher. That night at Cambridge, he delivers a sermon more than anything else. And so yeah, Baldwin. I mean, that's kind of so Baldwin, as you mentioned, he ends up eventually, finding, his escape from Harlem in some ways through words, through language as well, because he begins he's trying to find ways to make a living as a writer. And he gets his start as a writer, as a literary critic, in the late 1940s. And he really wants to write a novel, a great novel about, kind of based on his own experiences growing up in Harlem, but he is having a hard time doing that. He meets some, people in the New York intellectual scene, and they say to him, "Why don't you start writing reviews, as kind of to get the discipline of a writer in place in your life?" And he does that, and then he realizes that he needs, in order to escape Harlem, he actually needs to physically escape, the United States. And so, as you mentioned, he leaves the U.S. and moves to Paris in the late 40s, and ends up spending really the rest of his life as what he called a transatlantic commuter. And there was something about that physical distance from the U.S. that he thought was important to try to really reflect on his experiences there. So yeah, by the time, I mean, so that's kind of the early years, and then, in the late 40s, early 50s, he gets that first novel published, Go Tell on the Mountain, in the early 50s. He's establishing himself as an essayist. He's really, I mean, many scholars argue that the essay is really his best form. And he's really just worked, throughout the 50s. He's writing in every genre. His second novel, Giovanni's Room, was published in 1956, which maybe we can talk about later. Was a very controversial and important novel. by the time, and he also gets work as a journalist eventually. His first travels to the American South are as a journalist to cover the Black liberation struggle for magazines like Harper's and Partisan Review. And so, by the time he meets Buckley, though, yeah, he's sort of this internationally famous writer. So, I mean, I would say the major moments. He's kind of on the ascent throughout the 50s, but in the early 60s, his third novel, Another Country, makes quite a splash in 1962, and then also in late 62, the major essay that will become the bulk of the Fire Next Time is published in the New Yorker magazine. And so he's kind of identified, really second only to Martin Luther King, as a kind of face of the Black liberation struggle. And he appears on the cover of Time magazine in May 1963, and he's this international literary celebrity by the time he meets Buckley. So that's kind of in Baldwin's role. I think just one more thing about Baldwin before we can talk about Buckley is he calls himself, he's never comfortable with like pretty much any label of any aspect of his life, but he's never comfortable with the label of activist or spokesperson. He thinks of himself first and foremost as an artist, as a writer, and he says that as he begins to engage in the civil rights struggle more directly by writing about it, he starts out by calling himself a witness. Like he says, my job is to write it all down. And he always recognizes there's a difference between the sort of work that he's doing and the sort of work that people like Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and others are doing. And so he kind of sees his role. I mean, I think Malcolm X put it really well when he called Baldwin the poet of the civil rights revolution, and that Baldwin was this person who was this extraordinarily gifted writer who was trying to really capture a sense of what the world looked like through the eyes of various people involved on various sides of the struggle. So that's kind of Baldwin in a nutshell.
Yeah, great, great overview. And I think also just to add this little point here with what Baldwin himself often mentions, his own experience of racial discrimination, both in the US and later in France as well. So that he has really that changed his own perspective again, I think. So really you mentioned this transatlantic view that he has, that maybe we can go into that a bit more later. Right, so from here I think we can just go over a bit to Buckley. Yeah, I think said before now that this is quite a different thing from Harlem, from Baldwin's youth. So Buckley is someone really comes from this privileged position, who moved in this elite circles of also of conservatives in the US. And right, so if you can maybe take us here through some of these stations and maybe already talk a bit about his views on race at that time.
Yeah. So yeah, Buckley is born in November 1925, so just about 15 months after Baldwin. He's also born in New York City, but as I say in the book, he may as well have been born on a different planet. Buckley's upbringing was radically different, from Baldwin's. Buckley was born to a family that was quite wealthy. His father was a real estate and oil man who'd made, lost, and regained fortunes in the U.S. And abroad, and he was a Texan, and he was somebody who really thought of himself as a kind of self-made man. And so I think that's really important to kind of know about Buckley's father in terms of some of the things he would teach his children. Buckley's mother, Aloise Steiner, she was a proud, self-described daughter of the Confederacy. She was from New Orleans. Her family was also quite wealthy, and so she sort of came from old money. And so Buckley, has this kind of, mother from old money, his father, kind of awash in new money. And with all this money, the family, provided quite an upbringing for their children. So they had a 47-acre estate in Sharon, Connecticut, where Buckley spent most of his childhood. And he and his many siblings were homeschooled, and they received this really elaborate, liberal arts education right there in their home. They were live-in tutors. They were, full-time servants in this living at this estate. There were part-time tutors who came in to teach the Buckleys every subject under the sun, and they were also taught through their tutors and through guests to the house. Intellectuals like Albert J. Nock would visit the house, and the parents themselves taught their children a particular worldview. So Buckley and his siblings were taught to believe. Well, first of all, they had a very kind of staunch, devout, conservative, hierarchical, kind of Catholicism that was central to their worldview, but also a political doctrine they called individualism. And the Buckleys used this term individualism as a kind of catch-all, as that was meant to capture their hostility to any form of collectivism. So, and that ranged from communism, socialism to the New Deal policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the Buckleys were also taught to be suspicious of democracy. And so, William F. Buckley Sr. Definitely he taught his children to believe that some people are fit to rule and others are fit to be ruled. And he taught them that as elites, they had particular responsibilities, and so that's one thing that kind of runs through Buckley's descriptions and his siblings' descriptions of what their parents taught them, is that they were taught to believe in hierarchy, but they were taught to believe in a kind of noblesse oblige, and their elitism, I argue in the book, from a very young age, is thoroughly racialized. I mean, they have people of color working for the family as servants, and they're the Buckley's brother Reed says, by any definition, our parents were the Buckley parents were racist, but their racism was a kind of genteel, humane, paternalistic, maternalistic racism, according to the Buckley children. They say that that their parents taught them to believe in racial hierarchy, but also taught them to believe that they had an obligation to take care of those beneath them. And so that's really an important, foundational, I think, part of Buckley's racial worldview. And so Buckley goes on from, growing up in that sort of a household to an elite prep school called Millbrook. And he's one thing he has in common with Baldwin is that Buckley is somebody who is very taken with the power of language, and he becomes, I argue in the book that Baldwin kind of set as his mission, he wanted to use language to find a way to, avoid becoming his father. Buckley doesn't want to become his father, but he wants to, he sets as his mission in life to use language to defend his father's worldview. And so Buckley really devotes himself, to mastering the English language. He becomes a very good debater at prep school. He's a gifted writer, from a fairly young age. And he goes off from prep school to serve in the U.S. Army for a couple of years, and then he enrolls at Yale as a 21-year-old freshman. And at Yale, he establishes himself in a real way in the late 40s, early 50s. Again, right around the same time that Baldwin's arriving on the intellectual scene. Buckley is sort of arriving on the intellectual scene, at least in a small way, at Yale, by becoming a real pain in the butt for most of the people on the campus, because he's he has these very deviant views of a lot of subjects, and he's able to express those deviant religious and political views through a couple of ways. One, through the Yale Political Union as a debater, and then also through the student newspaper, the Yale Daily News. He becomes the chairman of the Yale Daily News, and he writes about national politics, international politics, and it promotes those right-wing beliefs that his parents taught him. And then he also gets engaged very deeply in campus politics and uses his editorial post to criticize professors who he views as either indifferent or hostile to Christianity and individualism. And so Buckley, he really, so he kind of causes a stir at Yale in those years, and then when he graduates from Yale, he writes a book-length indictment of his alma mater. So God and Man at Yale is his first book, and it's a critique of not only Yale but American higher education in general. which Buckley says, people in higher ed sort of hide behind this, what he calls the hoax of academic freedom, to promote, collectivist and atheistic ideas. And so he says that Yale, like a lot of elite institutions, is marked by this paradox. Parents, Christian individualist parents, send their children off to university only to have them corrupted and turned into atheistic socialists. And so Buckley, that book is published in the early 50s, and Buckley gets a lot of heat for, a lot of his views, because he essentially calls for the overthrow of the idea of academic freedom, and calls on alumni and trustees to exert more control over hiring of faculty and control over the curriculum. And so Buckley, he gets panned by most reviewers, but he proves to be impossible to ignore. And he goes on from there to write a book-length defense of Joseph McCarthy, which is, of course, even more controversial. It's published a couple years later. And so, yeah, Buckley by the mid 50s is sort of arrived as this right-wing provocateur, and what he really wants to do, though, is to have an impact on day-to-day politics. And he's happy with the success of his books, but he wants to have a more immediate impact. And so he decides to do that through journalism, and he tries to work for one publication, the American Mercury, but Buckley wasn't cut out to be anybody's employee, and he really wanted a magazine of his own that would be a sort of vehicle for forming a conservative movement. Because in the country at the time, there were disparate groups on the right that were sort of, they were identified as being on the right by their hostility to Roosevelt and to Truman, and sort of their anti-communist views. But Buckley saw that there was a role that a magazine could play in trying to really cohere various disparate groups on the right. So he wanted to get libertarians, who were especially worried about growing state power and the economic realm. He wanted to get them together with traditionalists who were worried about the perceived decline of religion and morality in the West. And so he ends up getting an advance on his inheritance from his dad, and goes out and fundraises in the mid 50s, and ends up creating this magazine, National Review, that has its first issue in November 1955. And Buckley is somebody who's very skilled as a recruiter, as a talent. He's very good at identifying talent, and he gets this group of writers to agree to write for this magazine. Many of these writers didn't like each other. They didn't trust each other. A good example is Russell Kirk, who was kind of a leading figure in the traditionalist side of things, and Frank Meyer, who's a leading person identified with the kind of libertarian wing of the right. They loathed each other, but Buckley got them to agree to collaborate in various ways through this magazine. With the major thing being that they disagreed on a lot of things, but they could agree about their hostility to communism and their hostility to liberalism. And so Buckley is this really important figure in terms of organizing, in terms of popularizing, and National Review ends up playing this really important role in American political development. And so, to come to the last part of your question, I mean, in this period, the mid 50s, right at the same time Buckley is founding National Review. Of course, it's very difficult to periodize, the civil rights movement, because of course the civil rights movement in some ways, begins in 1619, as many have pointed out. But there's the civil rights struggle is definitely heating up, coming to the forefront of a lot of people's minds in the same period when Buckley is putting together National Review. So you have the Brown versus Board school desegregation decision in 1954. You have the dramatic backlash against that decision in the South, the rise of the white citizens councils, the various things happening in Congress. The Southern Manifesto ends up being declared in 1956 in resistance to desegregation. You have the lynching of Emmett Till, which gets international attention. You have the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, the rise of Martin Luther King. All this is happening right in the same period when Buckley is getting National Review started. And so that's one of the big questions that is before him is, as he's starting this conservative magazine in 1955, where will it come down on these questions of race and civil rights? And one of the things I argue in the book is it's not a foregone conclusion that someone founding a conservative magazine in the United States in 1955 will take a hostile view to civil rights. The greatest, kind of partisan faction resisting civil rights, of course, were Southern Democrats. Buckley considered himself to be a conservative Republican. And there were conservative Republicans like Senator William Noland, who Buckley quite liked, actually had him write the lead article for the first issue of National Review, a senator from California who was, a supporter of civil rights. There were politicians that Buckley liked who were supportive of civil rights, but Buckley chose another course, and so Buckley, from the very beginning of National Review, makes it very, they're very strongly opposed to the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision. They believe it's a usurpation of power, not just by the courts, but by the federal governments. They say it's not just a matter of courts getting involved in educational policy, and that's not appropriate institutionally. Buckley and National Review, they're opposed to any federal intervention to try to dismantle Jim Crow segregation in the South. And they make that clear in every possible way in those early years of National Review. And so there's a lot of kind of detail in terms of how they rationalize it. But I mean, the important thing for listeners to know is that National Review is they're anti-Brown, they're critics of Martin Luther King, they're critics of just about every move in the Black liberation struggle except for economic boycotts. They're okay with economic boycotts as a legitimate form of social protest, but they're not in favor of any sort of legal intervention to bring about an end to segregation. They're critics of every meaningful piece of civil rights legislation. They're critics of the sit-in protesters. They're critics of the Freedom Riders. They're against the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. So Buckley, by the time he arrives at Cambridge in 65, has established himself as as a leading critic of the Black liberation struggle, as somebody resisting every step forward in the civil rights revolution. And so that's one of the reasons that adds to the drama of the moment of him clashing with Baldwin.
Right. Yeah. So I think you've really set up exactly here this really opposing views of the two men, and so Buckley, Baldwin, they are now invited to the debate in Cambridge. We're jumping a bit ahead in time now, 1965 at Cambridge University, and so this is quite a big thing. There's anticipation. There's a big audience there. Also, of course, this I think is the quite. If you look actually at this video, which you mentioned, it's easy to find online, so it's for listeners a good idea to check this out. So I think this very traditional debate context. Of course, a mostly white audience, of course, if you look at this footage. So, maybe if you can just briefly just talk a bit more here about the setting of the debate.
Yeah. So the Cambridge Union had just marked its 150th anniversary. The world's oldest debating society, very prestigious debating society, obviously at one of the elite, universities in the world, a training ground for a lot of, British statesmen. The union itself, the Union Debating Chamber, is, modeled after the House of Commons, not by accident. These students are thinking of themselves as future leaders, and here they are in this space, debating, major issues of the day. And the union was the debate kind of happened by accident in some ways. It all started, and this is one of the mysteries I had to try to solve as I started working on the book, was kind of how did these two guys end up there that night? And there hadn't really been anything of great detail written about the story behind the debate. And so one of the really cool things about this project was most of my work prior to this book has been 19th century work, so I couldn't do interviews with anybody. They wouldn't return my phone calls or my letters, and I tried to get in touch with Frederick Douglass. But yeah, in this case, the students who hosted the debate in 65, many of them are still with us. So I was able to interview a number of the students who hosted the debate, and then also go into the archives of Baldwin and Buckley and find a lot of the sort of back and forth correspondence in terms of setting up the debate. So yeah, essentially the debate, the debate since the 30s, the Cambridge Union it was primarily a student debating society, but since the 30s, the union had had this practice of inviting distinguished orators to come in as guest speakers to participate with the students in debate. And so Buckley and Baldwin ended up being invited as a result of Baldwin's publicist in the UK was promoting the paperback release of his third novel, Another Country, and he reached out to the union and asked if they would host a book event for Baldwin. And Peter Fullerton, the undergraduate who was the president of the union at the time, said, no, we won't host a book event because this is a debating society, but we are willing to host Baldwin, if he wants to debate someone on themes related to themes of his writing, we'd be happy to host that. And so then it kind of from there various pieces fell into place, and they end up in this space that night. And it was a space that was just the last thing on the sort of setup is it was a space that was very Buckley had not debated at the Cambridge Union yet to that point. He ended up debating several times after the Baldwin debate, but it was a space that was not foreign to him in a lot of ways because he had been a formal debater since he was in his teen years, and he was somebody who as he established himself as a kind of public intellectual in the 50s, he was somebody who was often debating on college campuses, and so he was somebody who was very familiar with that scene. Baldwin, it was definitely a different scene for Baldwin. Baldwin was somebody who loved to talk, who loved to debate, who loved to argue, but formal debate was not part of his background, and so it was a very to have Baldwin walk into this predominantly white space with the kind of history of that space into a context in which the sort of rules of the game were largely new to him. There was a lot of ways in which that added to the drama of the moment as they got there. And then the actual festivities began. So I don't know if you want to talk about that next.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So my idea was here to jump in a bit into this debate on the topic, the American dream at the expense of the American Negro. And so for me, I think of course we can't go into the whole debate now here. I would like to just kind of grab out two short moments here that I found really interesting. So you've really set the scene already now. We have now this debate starting. We have first two Cambridge students who start up the debate. Then we have Baldwin coming in, and after that we have Buckley who follows. And so for me, I think I would like to quote here, make two short quotes by the two debaters, and then if you could give a bit your thoughts on them, that would be great. So the first one by Baldwin, it's quite early in his own speech, and he starts out talking about Western movies and basically his own realization as a young boy that he himself is actually not Gary Cooper. He's not the white American, but he identifies with the Native American. So this shock of identification when he was watching a movie, and he goes on to say that it comes as a great shock that the country which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and identity has not in its whole system of reality allowed any place for you. So yeah, I mean it's difficult, of course, to quote Baldwin as a very talented orator, but I think here we have this kind of this psychological shock that really comes through for me. So maybe if you would like to first to just comment here on maybe a bit on this quote or also on Baldwin's speech.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I want to just modify one thing I said before. I mean, when I referred to like the debate beginning as I referred to festivities, which is not the right term. I want to retract that term, because I think there's something about this event that is a kind of spectacle, and there's obviously the drama of the cameras being there and all that. But that I want to retract that term because I think it doesn't. There was also a kind of of course the seriousness of the moment is there as well. And so although Baldwin walks into this space in part knowing that formal debate is this combination of sort of intellectual exercise and performance art. And I think Baldwin, although it was a new space for him, he felt right in that moment an incredible sense of responsibility that I want to make sure I get across. That in that moment, right in the middle of the Selma campaign, indeed the same night that Baldwin and Buckley debate in the UK, across the ocean, there's a protest in Marion, Alabama, that ends up with Jimmy Lee Jackson being mortally wounded by Alabama law enforcement officers. So I just wanted to say that quickly because I already feel guilty about using that term. But yeah, so Baldwin then, so two students get up and they deliver one speech on each side. So there's a student assigned to the Baldwin side of the motion and a student assigned to Buckley. So they deliver their short speeches. And then Baldwin gets up and really, he says right at the beginning, I'm here as a kind of Jeremiah, right? So he's sort of announcing to here's this, former young minister, this preacher, who's announcing that he's there, to deliver a sermon about white supremacy. And yeah, and you identify a really important series of lines. It's sort of there's this, like a minister, in a sort of in a very much a preacher fashion. Baldwin uses repetition really powerfully in that period in the speech when he says, as you pointed out, it comes as a great shock to discover. It comes as a great shock to discover. And so he, as you point out, he uses this line about Gary Cooper and these Western cowboy films and as you said, he comes as a great shock to discover when you see Gary Cooper killing the Indians, that the Indians were, and you're rooting for Gary Cooper, the Indians were you, right? And then he puts that in tandem with that other line that you just used, that you discover comes as a great shock to discover the flag to which you pledge your allegiance has not pledged its allegiance to you. And that, I think those are really well chosen lines, Richard, because that really captured. Baldwin is really obsessed with this kind of nexus of identity, morality, and power. And so he really, much of his writing, his fictional writing, his nonfiction writing, he's really thinking about these questions of identity. Who do we take ourselves to be individually and collectively, and how does our sense of self lead us to treat our sense of reality, our sense of who we are, lead us to treat other human beings, and how are these sort of questions of power, who has power, who doesn't, how do they shape, how does the sort of power question shape the identity and morality questions? And so for Baldwin, a lot of the story of our identities is really bound up in mythology, right? And I think the cowboy, the cowboy and Indian sort of mythology is one that's really important to him because he sees it in the world around him as this kind of really obvious, when one reflects on it, this really obvious example of myth making, right, that we do in order to help give ourselves a sense of identity. And so he talks about the ways in which, as he's watching those films, it's very clear to him, who the heroes are and who you're supposed to root for. But then, upon reflection, recognizing that, as you said, like the shock of recognition, right? I think is a really great way of putting it. Is that, wait a second, what is the purpose of this mythology really? What are we trying to do when we put images like that up on the screen? And what did the various, what did the various images represent in terms of our sense of self? And so Baldwin recognizes, as he reflects later on, watching those films as a young person and having that sense of identification with Gary Cooper, as he then like thinks about the mythology of something like the Pledge of Allegiance, right, and thinks about the ways in which American identity has in many ways mainstream American identity has kind of left people like him out of what it means to be an American, right? And so he's combining those two things, and I think that that juxtaposition is really powerful, because for Baldwin, he's interested in things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and he's interested in politics on one level, but he always is interested in thinking about the ways in which our politics are manifestations of these deeper questions of self, and so I think that, and he's also, mixed into that is this interest he has in pop culture, basically, and how the ways in which pop culture can help us understand these deep questions of self and these big political questions. So in many ways, Baldwin is a kind of forerunner of cultural studies or something, in the sense that he's really interested in this intersection of all these things together. And so yeah, I mean, I think that just taking a step back then from that, those two passages you quoted, Baldwin's speech is in many ways focused on what he calls at several moments in the speech, our sense of reality, right? How is it that we view the world, and how, as we react to something like the motion before the House, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. Baldwin says before we can even really have a discussion about that, we have to recognize that our sense of reality, there's just these assumptions that we bring to a question, to a motion like that, in many ways, unless we really reflect deeply about our assumptions and our sense of self, and how our experiences will shape how we even hear those words coming into our ears. Baldwin says we can't really have a meaningful, moral or political conversation. And so Baldwin is this really fascinating figure, in that he's not a conventional philosopher. He doesn't fit into any sort of disciplinary category in terms of how he thinks, but he's a very deep and profound thinker. And I think that those lines that you pointed out really capture that rather well.
Yeah, right. And I think also something I really noticed with Baldwin, also in other interviews, if you look at them, he's often really questioning the terms, of what the interviewer, specific terms that he's asked. And here also, I think what you've been showing here during this debate, I noticed how he's really, questioning maybe the whole idea of the American dream. Right. So from here, I think you've really summed up a lot on Baldwin's speech already. So from here, I wanted to take a second moment from that speech and give you another quote, this time from William Buckley. And another thing that for me that I really noticed when watching is also this, that you can, I think, at least sense through the video, is the audience's reaction, which is really gives this huge standing ovation to Baldwin. And with Buckley, you can mention it. Maybe we have a bit of different reaction, maybe a bit less enthusiastic. So, but we can say it like that. So with Buckley, I'm just gonna quote. It's quite early from his own speech, so he comes up. Baldwin talks about 15 minutes. Buckley comes up here and starts early on responding to Baldwin. So I'm just shortening a bit this quote. So Buckley is saying here first that the fact that responding to Baldwin, that Baldwin's skin is black, is utterly irrelevant to the arguments you make. And from this, he then follows up. I'm jumping a bit here, but he's saying that also James Baldwin's charges that he made are not so much that our American ideals have failed Baldwin, but rather that we have no ideals. Yeah, for me at least, really this impression also generally of Buckley's arguments of really not actually really engaging with Baldwin's ideas, but giving this confrontational view. If you could give us your thoughts here on Buckley's speech.
Yeah. Well, as you point out, I mean, Buckley, he had a lot of experience debating, but he, as he listens to this long standing ovation Baldwin gets, and the Cambridge Union, it was not very common for anyone to get a standing ovation, so it was a very dramatic moment. And then Buckley says, and as he reflects on the debate later, he said, "I knew it wasn't going to be my night." And so he's confronted with this question of how does he engage the question? How does he engage the crowd? And as you point out, he comes out swinging. I mean, he starts out by saying that he cannot really deal with Baldwin's arguments unless he treats Baldwin as if he were a white man, right? Is the line Buckley uses. And what's interesting about that setup is that Baldwin, Buckley, part of what Buckley is saying is that Baldwin has been given a pass. Like, people have not really engaged his arguments in a serious way because they've essentially conceded the argument to him because they want to affirm his identity. And so Buckley essentially says that to treat Baldwin as a black man is what Buckley says pretty explicitly in the introduction, is to treat him in such a way is to not take his arguments seriously. And so this idea of treating him as a white man, that's what Buckley means by it. So it's definitely Buckley is intentionally sticking his thumb in the collective eye of those students and the audience that he thinks might be thinking similarly to the students. And so so this idea of that is part of what he's getting at, and then he goes from there to this idea that essentially he accuses Baldwin of saying not just that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals. And Buckley, this is a central part of Buckley's approach in the debate, is that he wants to convince the audience that Baldwin is a radical, hell bent on overthrowing Western civilization. And so one thing that's about the BBC recording that I should point out to listeners is that it is edited to fit within an hour. And so one thing we were able to discover in the research for the book, which will be useful to future historians who want to write about the debate, is we were trying to find. We knew there was stuff missing, and we definitely knew there was stuff missing from the Buckley speech, because Buckley says things. There was a New York Times Magazine condensed transcript of the debate published about 2.5 weeks after the debate, and there's things in the condensed transcript that aren't in the video. So we knew there were things missing, and we were able to track down an old reel-to-reel audio recording of the debate. And so the full Buckley speech is included as a transcript, as an appendix as a transcript in the book, and then the audio recording is included with the audio book for The Fire Is Upon Us. But so one thing that's clear, though, is that Buckley says, just on this point of we have no ideals, he says, at one point in the speech, this is something not picked up in the BBC recording, that Baldwin would have you raid the libraries and burn all the copies of Plato and Aristotle and the Bible, and he wants to overthrow the idea of the rule of law and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so part of Buckley's strategy is to say that Baldwin is this dangerous radical, and he does not believe in the things that you believe in, right? And he refers to the faith of our fathers, and he says that it's also the faith of your fathers, to this audience of British elites. And so that's central to his argument, and he proceeds from there, to make various other arguments. But that's, really the bulk of his speech is really this kind of attempt to make Baldwin come across as dangerous, and that was really Buckley's style. Throughout his career as a debater, he was always much more comfortable, trying to point out the dangers of his opponent's position as opposed to defending his own. And so it's really a central theme. And the line from Baldwin, it's not really clear to me still if Buckley really read Baldwin seriously. I think that he certainly read, though, Gary Wills, one of Buckley's writers at the time for National Review, had written a review of The Fire Next Time that was published in spring 1963, that Buckley, I think, clearly had read, very carefully, and had actually probably read it right before the Cambridge debate, and it informed a lot of his argument. And I think that the part of the idea there that Wills develops, I think, in a more nuanced way than Buckley does, is that Wills also believes that Baldwin is somebody who is rejecting the Western tradition and so on, and that Wills basically calls on those who want to defend the West to stand up to Baldwin and tell him why there are things in the West worth defending, and in fact things in the West that are Baldwin himself should be appealing to in the various struggles he's a part of. Now, I mean, I think one of the things I argue in the book is this is a huge, I think it's a huge, a deeply flawed reading of Baldwin. I think, but what Baldwin's up to is in fact much more complicated than that. But that's not really. I mean, so in many ways, I'm more disappointed in Wills for not seeing that than I am in Buckley. I think Buckley is always this kind of intellectual. Intellectually, he's a pugilist. He's like interested in winning a fight as opposed to really getting to the truth, in my opinion. So most of the time, so yeah, that's kind of the strategy Buckley takes, and he gives a kind of meandering speech. I think even Buckley's most ardent defenders acknowledge that the Cambridge debate was not his best performance. He seemed to be rattled in various ways and didn't really deliver his best speech. But yeah, that is at least my explanation of those particular quotes that you identify.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, about actually how you found really a longer part of this speech. So this could really add a lot more to the debate.
One thing I should say about that for folks who are interested is the students, like in the House of Commons, the students could they could stand up and be acknowledged by the speaker for a question or a point of information, and no one stood up during Buckley's, or I'm sorry, during Baldwin's speech. I mean, it's sort of in many ways the speech he delivered. It would have been, awkward at the least, and maybe profane, to stand up because he sort of delivered this sermon, and it would have been odd to sort of interrupt him. But Buckley, on the other hand, got a lot of students standing up asking to be, called upon, and he called on several of them. And only one of those comments from the crowd is picked up in the BBC recording. And there's 4 or 5 others that are in the audio recording, and those are I think they're really interesting and helpful in terms of getting a sense of some of the things on the minds of the students, and also. Buckley's responses are very revealing. I mean, he's a master at deflating a situation with humor, but then kind of coming around to to maybe even a more radical point than he had already made. And so yeah, that's one thing that's really cool about the audio recordings. And one of the Cambridge students, Adrian Vinson, deserves a lot of credit because he was the one person who kept. He had this reel-to-reel audio recording of the Baldwin and Buckley speeches, in his attic in England, and he was nice enough to share it with us for the book.
That's great. Yeah, right. So I mean, I think we've already covered really a lot of ground. What happened in this debate, and so for me, maybe a last point before just regarding the debate. Would be if you can just quickly talk a bit more about this closing statements of both debaters. I think to me that seemed very revealing. You've mentioned a bit before, but again, this deep contrast between both the ideas of both men, with Baldwin really, I think, stressing here the African American participation, the need also to cooperate between African Americans, white Americans, to actually have a future in this country. And whereas with Buckley, for me at least, I got really the sense that he closes on what we would call maybe a race war rhetoric now, of really raising fears of a war in America. So maybe if you could just give a bit some impressions on that, and also maybe just on these differences, this difficulty of communicating between the two men.
Yeah. The closing of each, they're so revealing, and yeah, I think the way you set it up is really perfect, because I think that those two particular lines from each closing really capture the nature of of the tragedy, the nature of the difficulty, however we want to put it. Baldwin, at the end of his speech, there's a lot in Baldwin's speech. As you pointed out, everyone should listen to watch the YouTube, and everyone should, read the transcript, because Baldwin's speech is really remarkable in many ways. And Baldwin, toward the end of his speech, he has this really powerful line, I think, that is central to what you're describing. Baldwin says, um, he has this really interesting idea. He says, "What concerns me most," and it ends up being what the chapter on the Baldwin speech in the book. I use that as the title, because Baldwin says, he talks about what concerns him most, and when he's describing what concerns him most, it's essentially, his concern is a kind of breakdown in the authority of reason, in the authority of discourse. In our ability to hear each other, to listen to each other, and he sort of sees that as the foundation of everything else. And what's really fascinating about Baldwin is that he's also, he's somebody who lets no one off the hook. And so, right before that point in the speech, he even, kind of criticizes Robert Kennedy, this kind of hero of liberals, for a particular way of thinking that he thought was also problematic. So it's not just about, whether or not Buckley is willing to listen. It's not just about whether, somebody like Robert Kennedy is willing to listen. He even says, when he's discussing what concerns him most, he says that, when I talk to a teenager in, any one of the country's, inner cities, it's not just that those teenagers are suspicious of things that somebody like Buckley would say or somebody like Kennedy would say. Baldwin says they're suspicious of things that I'm saying, things that Martin Luther King is saying. They don't feel a sense of hope, that they can act. Their concerns are actually being listened to, that anyone really cares about what life is like at the margins of the society. And so Baldwin is really, I say that, the fire next time is not a wish, it's a warning, right? He's trying to say, in this period in the mid 60s, look, we have a responsibility. Those of us, he says, I'm not interested in your guilt. I'm interested in you taking responsibility for your history. And that's something that he says to everybody. That's something that we all have this responsibility to come to terms with our history and to do something about it. And so for Baldwin, I mean, he's interested in politics and law on some level, but for him, it's always this deeper question of our ability to hear each other, our ability to listen to each other. And then, so then to contrast that with the way Buckley ends his speech, right? I mean, Baldwin has made this, plea, will you just listen? Will you just treat me as a human being? And then Buckley, as you said, he gives, this meandering speech, and then he ends up at this point where he says, that what concerns him most, right, is that people like Baldwin and those who are listening to them will reach out, for radical solutions that are meant to overthrow, the faith of our fathers, the things that we care about, the Western civilization, et cetera, et cetera. And he kind of gives these examples: the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, Plato, Aristotle, the Bible, and so on. And he says, I'm fearful that if they will, and so Buckley kind of uses very explicitly something he'd been doing and writing for a long time, this analogy where he puts, he uses the Nazi analogy, and he says that the civil rights protesters in his analogy play the role of the Nazis, and people like him play the role of the defenders of civilization. And he says that if it comes to a radical confrontation, it will be incumbent on us not just to argue in places like the Cambridge Union, but to take up arms. And he uses the line, the Dunkirk line from Churchill, to take up arms to defend Western values, against those who would overthrow them. And so, and that, to me, that's why I think you framing the question that way is really right on, because that contrast of what Baldwin is trying to say and what Buckley is refusing to hear, really sets up rather perfectly this really, this impasse. And I think, and Buckley is in many ways a kind of, he's an odd character to put with Baldwin in many ways. I mean, I've gotten a lot of questions over the last couple months, since the book's come out, about putting the two of them together, they're so different in terms of the sorts of thinkers they are. They're so different in terms of the kind of what they took their role to be. But I think in some ways, Buckley is this kind of perfect, foil, and perfect, to use Baldwin's lens, which is so powerful in looking at, all these questions of identity, morality, and power, to use the Baldwinian lens to look at somebody like Buckley, who is in many ways a kind of extreme case, maybe a lot of assumptions that a lot of Americans hold taken to their, logical conclusion. And he's saying things out loud that a lot of people are thinking but unwilling to say. There's something really powerful about that I think is really, one of the reasons that this story is really important. And I should say that Buckley, in the aftermath of the debate, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the chat, I have a chapter, one substantive chapter after the debate, and Buckley took great pride in this performance. I mean, he says in 1968 that it's the debate he lost, so but we should tell listeners to spoiler alert. Baldwin wins, 544 to 164, and at Cambridge. But Buckley says, I lost that debate by the largest margin of any debate I ever had, but I'm most proud of my performance. And he says the reason he's proud is because he didn't give them one goddamn inch, is the line Buckley uses. And Baldwin, for his part, when he doesn't reflect much on Buckley, explicitly after the debate, but he does say when he's talking about Buckley that he recognized that Buckley was somebody who was unwilling to listen, and he was a bully, and that he essentially did not have any serious interest in getting to the truth. He had his interest was in conserving his own power and power of people that he the sort of his preferred political leaders and that sort of thing. And so that and you think about where we are today, right? When you think about what concerned Baldwin most, it seems like in many ways things have gotten much worse. And so although there has been progress made on various using various metrics in terms of what Baldwin was worried about, there are a lot of ways in which our the sort of moral situation in which we find ourselves has in many ways gotten worse. Our senses of reality are further apart, and in fact, people are seem to be sort of celebrating that in some ways in some of the political atmospheres. The sense that we this kind of post fact post truth world. And so yeah, I think Baldwin, I don't want to speak for Baldwin, he died in 1987, but I think that in many ways his themes, his lessons, his legacy are more important than ever. I mean, I think that's one thing I hope comes out of this book and the other books that are being written about Baldwin, is that people will go back and read Baldwin, because I think he has so much to teach us, and so many things to help us through thinking through the political moment in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more on that. So I think you've really taken us through now nicely through the end of this debate, and coming already now to the relevance of the debate, but also I think really what you've shown us, the relevance of both participants to today. So for me, it would be really, for a last question that came up for me, is really how you would consider this ongoing relevance. For me, really one thing that I noticed was when I was talking a bit about the closing statements before, also this difficulty, this impossibility maybe of communication that is often stressed nowadays, I think, in US politics, with the partisanship and so on, that I think that I noticed some parallels here, especially with Buckley. And on the other hand, what's also often starting, I think, luckily, there's a rising interest again lately in Baldwin. There was a recent documentary called "I'm Not Your Negro" that makes really lots of parallels, interesting parallels, with the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think really what's increasingly becoming clear is really this continuing discrimination that's ongoing, and that Baldwin is really speaking to back then. So I see kind of these two two parallels here, but would be really interested on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that there's ongoing relevance. I mean, I think all those points you made are right on in terms of Buckley and Baldwin in ways in which they speak to the present moment. I mean, one of the big themes on the Buckley side of continuing relevance that comes through in the book is, Buckley is somebody who, he plays this outsized role in American political culture for such a long period of time. So he's, I sort of wrap the book up mostly in 1968, and of course, a lot happens. Buckley lives until 2008, and he has a TV show that's on the air for 33 years. He has his newspaper column running 3 times a week. He's got his magazine. He's all over the place giving lectures, and so he's this really important figure in American political culture. And one thing about Buckley that's been fascinating to watch over the last few years is that there's been a lot of lamenting, like, where it's too bad we don't have William F. Buckley around anymore as this kind of intellectually serious conservative who, even when people disagreed with him, they appreciated his seriousness and so on. And there's also been, Buckley's defenders have pointed out that he was not a fan of Donald Trump personally, and made that clear, in writing in the year 2000, and a piece that he wrote when Trump was thinking about running for president in those days. But I mean, one thing that I want to say about Buckley's relevance. So there's a lot of sort of oh, I wish we had William F. Buckley around. And I think that narrative about Buckley is, it's important and interesting, and thinking about ways in which the role he played in the media landscape and in the political landscape, and what we have now, and what stylistically, at least, maybe we miss about William F. Buckley if we miss him. But I think substantively, one of the big themes of the book is that I think Buckley has been too easily let off the hook for his role in promoting a particular kind of racial politics. And although Buckley did make he made some progress on race in the period after the focus, after the period I focus on in the book, there are a lot of ways in which he celebrated certain aspects of a politics of racial resentment that have a huge impact on the way a lot of the American right has evolved over the years. And so, I mean, Buckley in the mid 60s, is, although he's a critic of people like George Wallace for various reasons, he's also attracted to the ways in which Southern segregationist like Wallace is tapping in to racial resentment. And Buckley writes editorials with titles like "The White Backlash," and he celebrates this idea of white backlash. Celebrates this idea of white people feeling a sense of marginalization and resentment as a result of, in response to Black liberation or other forms of liberation. So Buckley really, in this period I focus on in the book, he's adapting. He recognizes he's never attracted to a kind of politics of race that is, has racial animus or race, explicitly racist language is a part of it. But he is in this position of intransigence, on these questions of rights and freedom. And so he adapts to a kind of more subtle, more coded politics of racial resentment, starts emphasizing things like resistance to busing, resistance to fair housing law. And I think that is something that we've seen. Of course, we saw it play out with the Southern strategy and things that Nixon would do to attract Northern Democrats to the coalition. And certainly, it's been central to what Trump and the people around him have done. And so, I think Buckley's relevance in that regard is really, really crucial. And then I think in terms of making sense of Baldwin's relevance, I mean, I think part of what Baldwin helps us do is to get beneath the surface of all of these political questions, right? So I think that when it comes to these questions of partisanship, and even the ways in which this evolving politics of racial resentment and how we've seen that play out in American politics, Baldwin is I think is certainly wants us to be thinking about those things on the surface level and doing what we can to combat anything that's going to undermine the cause of justice. But he's also constantly going to be calling on us to go beneath the surface of all that and think about these questions of self. Think about these questions of going back to the beginning of our conversation, the questions of what mythologies, what delusions continue to keep us in thrall, and what mythologies are preventing us from really coming to terms with our history. And so for Baldwin, he's always he always thinks there's these kind of deep existential questions at the foundation of all of our morality and politics. And so partly what he wants us to do is to sort of figure out, it's easy to dismiss a lot of people who we disagree with politically as evil, but Baldwin is and there's plenty of evil in politics. Baldwin will be sure to acknowledge that, but he also wants us to point out, to realize that there's a lot of people in the political world who are operating really on the basis of fear, right? And so Baldwin wants us to try to figure out, what it is that we're so afraid of, and try to come to terms with that and help each other to come to terms with that, because until we can do that, he doesn't really think we're going to make the sorts of radical changes that we need to make in our social, economic, and political lives. And so that I think is Baldwin's enduring relevance. And I think something like Black Lives Matter, as you point out, there are ways in which Baldwin's the sort of renaissance in Baldwin, Baldwin studies and Baldwin kind of entering into the popular culture is thanks to people in the streets, like folks involved with Black Lives Matter, who are appealing to Baldwin and other other thinkers like him to try to say, part of what Baldwin was doing, throughout this period, was to try to just make this, basic claim of human dignity, not just a claim, but a demand of a recognition of human dignity, and try to point out all the ways in which, as he says in the Cambridge speech, the millions of details of every day in which we communicate to some human beings that their lives matter less than others. And Baldwin really wants to say it's easy to go after the most, the sort of most obvious, sort of guardians of the fortress of white supremacy, the people, the demagogues, and the people who are saying explicitly racist things. But Baldwin says what's the harder thing to do, and the thing that all of us need to do, is to think about ways in which the millions of details of every day, we are all complicit into maintaining structures of power that are unjust. And so that's that's Baldwin's most powerful legacy for me, is the ways in which he calls on each and every one of us to reflect on that, and not only to reflect on it, but to take responsibility for it.
Right. Yeah, I think these are great closing words, not on the debate, but I think for this episode, and a lot of food for thought. So yeah, I want to thank you so much, Nick, for coming to the program today and for discussing this with us.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's been a real pleasure, and I appreciate the work that Ask Historians is doing. I'm a real big fan, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate it too.